most places up at 7 or 8 Celsius. So a mild day to come on Tuesday. Quite a grey start with outbreaks of rain, and it will be windy again across northern Scotland. Now, not as windy as through the weekend, but we could still see gusts of 50 to 60 miles an hour, and because of those recent storms, that could still also bring some disruption. So there is a yellow warning in place across northern Scotland, some brightness across southern Scotland, northern England, and look at the temperatures up to 11 to maybe 13 Celsius, so really quite mild. Stays blustery across northern Scotland with further showers through the evening. It stays damp across Wales, Northern Ireland, parts of the Midlands with rain and drizzle here and there. Clearer skies again across southern Scotland and northeast England. The winds will continue to be a feature of the weather this week, although not as strong as at the weekend. Fairly mild for the next few days, but a colder spell on Friday.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world. If
you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Hello and welcome to The Briefing, your afternoon fix of all the latest political news, debate and analysis here on GB News. I'm Dan McCaffrey, standing in for Gloria De Piero, who is having a day off. And here's what's coming up over the next hour. Well, Sue Gray's finally handed in her report, well, an update to her report into Downing Street parties. And the Prime Minister is now expected to make a statement in the Commons this afternoon. Well, the latest from Westminster, big day in politics, but maybe not as big as we might have expected. Also ahead, April's rise in national insurance is set to go ahead as inflation soars and the energy price cap ends. We'll be speaking to an economist. And as Boris Johnson is due to speak to Vladimir Putin this week, we'll speak to a senior Labour MP and a former British ambassador to Russia about the worrying situation on the border of Ukraine. And we've got Gloria's interview with the Labour MP, Pauline Latham, in which she speaks about the tragic and sudden death of her son. All that and so much more over the next hour between 12 and 1. But first, at noon, here's the very latest news with Rosie White.
Good afternoon. It has just gone 12 o'clock. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date on GB News. Now, the Prime Minister has received an update on Sue Gray's investigation into Downing Street's alleged lockdown parties. It's understood the senior civil servant has not submitted her full report to Number 10 after the Met Police asked her to redact parts of it. Well, Boris Johnson said earlier today he sticks absolutely to what he said in the past when questioned about his denials of any wrongdoing. Parliamentary sources say they're expecting the Prime Minister to make a statement to the House of Commons this afternoon. If he does that, we'll bring it to you here.
We're going to have to wait and see the outcome of the. You're going to have to wait and see the outcome of the investigations. But of course, I stick absolutely to what I've said in the past. But I'm here to talk about I'm here to talk about the free ports that we're doing around the UK, and what they are also doing. What they are also doing. What I stick in complete. You have to wait and see what the investigations are. With all due respect.
The government is expected to announce a U-turn over compulsory COVID vaccines for NHS workers. The Health Secretary is reportedly going to scrap the policy over fears it could lead to a major staffing crisis. Critics are also calling for the change because the Omicron variant of coronavirus is milder than previous variants. Schools today are closed and thousands have been left without power after back-to-back storms battered parts of the UK. 2 people were killed by falling trees in 90-mile-an-hour winds at the weekend, including a 9-year-old boy. A yellow weather warning remains in place for Scotland and the north of England. Storm Malik was followed by Storm Corrie just 24 hours later. People in Tyne and Wear say the damage has been shocking.
You would never ever think in a million years that would happen, especially weighting it of stone. But it shows you how strong wind is.
Trees down, gable end, down Sion Terrace is gone.
We've been in the northeast, we've just come to get used to it really, but these last few years the weather seems to be just getting worse and worse.
Manchester United footballer Mason Greenwood is still in custody after being arrested on suspicion of rape and assault. Police say they were made aware of images and videos posted on social media by a woman reporting incidents of physical violence. Manchester United has suspended the player, announcing he won't train or play for the Premier League club until further notice. New evidence shows the suspect in the Madeleine McCann investigation worked at the holiday apartments in Portugal shortly before the 3-year-old disappeared in 2007. A documentary airing tonight on German TV reveals the 44-year-old paedophile known as Christian B carried out repairs at the resort. The man, who is currently in prison for rape, denies any involvement. A Brexit freedoms bill, which the government claims will cut £1 billion of red tape for UK businesses, is set to be brought forward. It affects how EU laws, which were kept for legal continuity after Brexit, are handled. Downing Street says the bill will ensure changes can be made easily and allow the country to capitalise on Brexit freedoms more quickly. The Prime Minister has warned it would be a disaster for Russia if it invades Ukraine. Boris Johnson says Russia needs to step back from the brink as the Russian Navy carried out exercises in the Norwegian Sea. The Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has also called for tensions to be de-escalated as he arrived in Hungary at the start of a diplomatic tour. Meanwhile, the government is due to unveil new measures making it easier to sanction Russian interests, a move Moscow has described as alarming. The charity Gamble Aware says up to 1 million women are at risk of harm from gambling. Research suggests that among women experiencing high levels of harm, 2 in 5 may not seek help, and many increased gambling over the winter months. Lisa Walker became addicted to gambling after winning a 6-figure sum in a Southend casino when she was 29.
I lost my house, I ended up homeless, and I ended up in a hostel with my 2 children through gambling. So I just want to say a big thank you to Gamble Aware for raising, this serious subject of women and gambling harms. And to anybody that's out there that's suffering, please don't suffer in silence.
Footballer Christian Eriksen has signed for Premier League club Brentford just 7 months after suffering a cardiac arrest on the pitch while playing for Denmark. The 29-year-old, who's been fitted now with an internal defibrillator, hasn't played since he collapsed at Euro 2020. The former Tottenham midfielder has signed a 6-month deal. You are now up to date here on GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's head back to the briefing with Darren McCaffrey.
A very welcome to the programme with me, Darren McCaffrey. It is 6 minutes past 12. You're on TV, on radio and online. Sue Gray, after weeks and weeks, what felt like the longest month, has finally presented an update of her report to the Prime Minister. Now, interestingly, of course, it is being called an update. We're not expecting to see the full report for 2 reasons. First of all, we know she wants to publish it in full, but she cannot do so without the Metropolitan Police, who are carrying out their own investigation. So we expect that much of the report will actually be redacted, and we won't see some of the interesting aspects of the report, some of the serious allegations about rule-breaking inside Number 10. But secondly, it is then expected that Sue Gray will release a much more full report, with the consent, of course, of the government later on when the Met have concluded their investigation. And we've just learned in the last couple of minutes that the Prime Minister is going to make a statement, as he said he would, in the Commons a bit later. We think around 3:30. Timing's a little bit up in the air, but we think around 3:30. Of course, we'll bring you that live here on GB News. Well, before all that, the Prime Minister this morning has been out and about on a visit to Tilbury Docks to mark 2 years since Brexit Day. He was asked about the possible government U-turn on vaccine mandates for NHS workers, the crisis in Ukraine, and, of course, about Partygate. And you'll get the impression he wasn't terribly keen to answer many of the questions.
I'm here to talk about, I understand, but
our viewers want to know the answer to that question.
Yeah.
Do you think that you, the Prime Minister, have done anything wrong?
You're going to have to wait and see the outcome of the. You're going to have to wait and see the outcome of the investigations. But of course, I stick absolutely to what I've said in the past. But I'm here to talk about I'm here to talk about the free ports that we're doing around the UK, and what they are also doing. What they are also doing. What I stick in complete. You have to wait and see what the investigations. And with all due respect, but what we're doing today is getting on with opening up free ports around the UK. 8 free ports we're going to do in England, 1 in Northern Ireland, 1 in Wales, 1 in Scotland at least, and they have massive potential to unite and level up.
Are you going to scrap plans to make vaccines mandatory for NHS workers?
My view about NHS workers and everybody who is involved in looking after vulnerable people, all healthcare professionals should get a vaccine. That's absolutely clear. I think that Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary, is going to be saying a bit more later on about how you might deal with different variants of coronavirus, because they have different implications when it comes to transmissibility. But you have to wait to hear what Saj says.
We heard a lot about Ukraine over the weekend. What are you going to be telling President Putin when you speak to him?
Well, what I will say to the President Putin, as I've said before, is that I think we really all need to step back from the brink, and I think Russia needs to step back from the brink. I think that an invasion of Ukraine and any incursion into Ukraine beyond the territory that Russia has already taken in 2014 would be an absolute disaster for the world, but above all, it would be a disaster for Russia. As you know, the UK supports the territorial sovereignty and integrity of Ukraine. We've been there since 2014, training Ukrainian troops under Operation Orbital, about 21,000 we've trained. We give lethal but defensive weaponry to Ukraine. But what I know is that the Ukrainians will fight. If you go to Ukraine, you talk to Ukrainians, I'm afraid any Russian incursion, any further Russian invasion will be bitterly and bloodily resisted.
There you go, that was the Prime Minister speaking a little bit earlier. We've just had it confirmed that 3:30 will be when Boris Johnson will speak in the Commons later, reacting to Sue Gray's report. That report was handed in to Number 10 a little bit earlier, within the last hour or so. Essentially, we were told by the Cabinet Office. We are expecting it to be made public between now and 3:30, so that the opposition and MPs get a chance to look at it, though, and I reiterate this again, it is expected to be heavily redacted with some of the, as I say, the more serious allegations simply not in it, because the Met are carrying out their investigation. And this all comes at a big week for politics, because the government, as we heard yesterday, are pressing ahead with the rise in national insurance as the cost of living soars. And there's a very real worry, as we were just hearing from the Prime Minister there, about whether Russia might invade Ukraine. In today's news, that it looks like the government is going to U-turn when it comes to vaccine mandates for NHS staff. So, to discuss all of this, I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Graham Stringer. He is the MP who is on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Labour, of course, and joins us down the line. Graham, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Just first of all, on Sue Gray's reports, What's your thoughts on what we think we might hear, or what would you like to see from the Prime Minister this afternoon?
It's absurdity on top of farce, isn't it? The police are investigating things that are alleged to have happened, or almost certainly did happen when they were there. They're going to find out what they didn't do several months ago, and that's stopping Sue Gray giving a full report. I think that's an extraordinary and silly situation. There are two issues I'm interested in, really. One is, will the report show that definitively that the Prime Minister lied to the Commons? If he did, he should go and resign straight away. And then secondly, are the police going to retrospectively issue a notice on him and the officials who were at parties in Downing Street? Those are the two outstanding things that will have real impact. Politically, I think the Prime Minister is determined as much as he can to stay on. And I think the Labour Party should put down a motion of no confidence, which we'll lose because we haven't got the numbers, but he will force Conservative MPs to say whether they want to stick with a Prime Minister who is a serial liar as the most important politician in this country. When we're faced with possible war in Ukraine, we're still at the tail end of an epidemic. We've got inflation increasing and people being driven into poverty.
In saying that, I don't think Sue Gray, it's within her scope to decide whether the Prime Minister potentially broke the ministerial code. I think ultimately it'll be potentially up to the Prime Minister himself or Tory MPs to make that conclusion. Yeah, I don't think it's within her remit to reach that conclusion about whether he broke the code or not. But we'll see, and we'll probably not almost certainly see today, given how redacted I think the report will be, Graham. Just on this point, though, about public opinion, lots of Tory MPs saying, well, you know what, actually, the anger's somewhat subsided. People have kind of fundamentally made up their minds. And that is why, to a degree, actually, the position of the Prime Minister seems slightly stronger than it did a couple of weeks ago, because Tory MPs seem to have concluded the public's not as concerned about this as initially thought. What's your sense from talking to your constituents?
Talking to my constituents, even those people who voted Conservative are sick of him, basically. They don't want a Prime Minister who has a reputation for lying. They've lost patience with him completely. The joke's worn thin. So I think they want him to go. In terms of Conservative MPs who I've talked to privately, they're unsure. I think his position amongst Conservative MPs, there is a limited amount of time that you can keep a furore going over these things. I think he is a bit more secure, certainly in the short term, with Tory MPs, but not with the public, and that's what the opinion polls show.
OK, Graham, let's move on to the other big issue, of course, this week, and that is what's happening on the Ukrainian border with Russia. We know Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, is in Budapest today. Liz Truss is due to go to Moscow, Boris Johnson to Eastern Europe as well later on this week. Is there a sense, though, that we're almost talking up war, and it becomes more likely if we talk about this likelihood that Russia's likely to invade Ukraine, as the government seem to be doing?
My sense is the opposite of that, actually. I think on the Foreign Affairs Committee, we've just had two delegations. I just got back from Bosnia, where tensions are rising, and the other half of the committee have just got back from the Ukraine. When we were in Bosnia, there was a real sense that they could very quickly descend back into civil war. The people, I didn't go to the Ukraine, but the people who went to the Ukraine came back saying that, and they visited the front line as well as Kiev, they came back saying people there were quite relaxed. The judgment of the Ukrainians was that they didn't think there was going to be an invasion. They've got 125,000 Russian troops on their border, but their view was that it was a negotiating position against the further expansion of NATO, and it was basically Putin flexing his muscles. Nobody's certain, only Putin can be certain. I think if you had the head of MI6 and the Prime Minister here, they're not certain. I think that the government is taking the right decision to be tough and say that there will be sanctions if the Russians do invade. But my sense, having talked to people who've been there and talked to a number of ambassadors from different countries, is that it looks less likely now than it did 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Fascinating stuff. As always, Graham, thank you so much for your time. That's Graham Stringer there, Labour MP and a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. And of course, as I say, the Prime Minister due to travel to Eastern Europe later this week. Ben Wallace in Hungary today. We will see how those events play out in the days to come. OK, we're going to pause there on GB News and the briefing this lunchtime. Coming up in just a couple of minutes, we'll be looking at that national insurance rise, what it means for you, I and the economy. And also we'll have the latest on that situation with Ukraine and Russia. We'll be speaking to a former British ambassador to Moscow in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Very welcome back to GB News. Do get in touch with us, by the way, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or indeed tweet us at GB News. We're going to come on to the Ukraine crisis in just a second, but lobby in Westminster has just broken up in the last couple of minutes. We're going to speak to Tom Harwood, our correspondent who's been there very shortly indeed. But Number 10, apparently, or the spokesperson for the Prime Minister, saying it cannot confirm if the bits that have been cut out from Sue Gray's report, of course, is going to be heavily redacted when that update is released later on today because of the police investigation. Well, Number 10 saying they cannot confirm that that full report will be published, which is clearly a change from what they seemingly had said in the past, and also refused to say if we would be told, the public, if Boris Johnson received a fixed penalty notice if he was to be fined by the police for breaking lockdown rules. We'll get the latest, as I say, from Tom in just a couple of minutes when he emerges from that briefing. But first, let's return to the situation involving Ukraine and Russia. We're delighted to say I'm joined by Sir Andrew Woods. He is the former British ambassador to Russia. A very good afternoon to you, Sir Andrew. I was just putting it to Graham Stringer, the member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, a little earlier, that the British government seemed to be talking up the prospect of war. Liz Truss saying it is likely when she was on the TV yesterday. Is there a fear that not just the British government but others are talking up the prospect of war in Ukraine, and that makes it even more likely?
I don't believe they're talking it up for that reason. The situation there is something completely unknown. It depends very much on what Putin wants, obviously. it depends also on how much Putin realizes what an extraordinary, stupid move would in the end be. Russia can't just take over Ukraine and hold it and live in peace.
The difficulty, of course, is that we're not entirely sure, though, what Russia's intentions is, do we, Sir Andrew? Is this going to be simply a quick incursion across the border? Is it trying simply to create instability? Or could they go for a full-out invasion, even trying to take the capital, Kiev?
Well, I agree, that is completely unknown. A bit like the other topic you were discussing, the Grey Report and so on. It's we're all in a guessing game as to what the Russians are trying to do. Their ideal is to push back NATO. In that context, making a fool of NATO would be good from their point of view, I suppose. But I think we must be prepared for the fact that this will remain, whatever the immediate situation may be, a constant threat.
And what really can the British government do in all of this? Ultimately, the Western Alliance is a little bit fractured in terms of the approach. What do you think kind of the British government's role is over the coming days? We know, for example, obviously there's lots of visits taking place to different parts of Europe, but what really can Britain achieve?
Well, I think it will help to sustain morale in Ukraine, but not just in Ukraine. One has to remember that if there is a Russian aggressive strike in some form or another against Ukraine, it will also have influences throughout the rest of Eastern Europe. So it is a danger, and what the Russians have demanded is something they won't get. So we'll have to see whether there's some sort of compromise is possible. To the extent the Russian fears that they will be assuaged. But at the moment it is completely unknown.
Yeah, indeed. And as you say, we're going to have to see how those events play out. We saw pictures there from the Ukrainian border of Russian and Ukrainian troops as that military build-up continues. Sir Andrew, thank you so much indeed. Sir Andrew Wood there, the former UK ambassador to Russia, joining us down the line. Well, let's move away from that and back home now, because rumours have been floating around over the last week or so that the government was likely to U-turn around the national insurance tax rise to keep its backbenchers on side and calm fears over the cost of living crisis. But the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have instead decided to stick to their guns and agreed that the national insurance increase will go ahead. So what will the impact be for you, me and the wider economy? Vicky Price is the Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research and the former Government Advisor, of course. Thank you, Vicky, for joining us. Just talk about, first of all, the impact on us as individual taxpayers, because this is quite a significant increase that people will really notice in their pockets.
There will indeed, and that, of course, is going to come on top of everything else. So the calculations are that if you are earning £20,000, I mean, the first 9,500 do not fall into the category of being taxed at all for national insurance. But the rest is, and you may be paying something below £100 a year more. So it's not huge if you just look at that. But of course, it comes on top of everything else. Everything else includes the increase in energy costs, which is very substantial and is probably going to be many more hundreds of pounds. It comes on top, of course, of inflation more generally, which is rising faster than wages. So real incomes are being squeezed, except in some professions, but generally on average, they're being squeezed. And it comes on top, of course, of interest rates, which have been going up. And we're going to have another meeting with the Monetary Policy Committee this Thursday, and we're probably going to see yet another increase in interest rates. So that will be the second one since they started raising rates. And that, of course, hits pockets as well.
Indeed. And I'm a bit confused about all this, Vicky, because you've got the Labour Party saying that this is essentially a jobs tax and that they want to see a more progressive form of taxation to help pay for social care and the National Health Service. And yet the government argue this is a progressive form of tax. Who's right?
It's reasonably progressive until you hit a cap, which is around £50,000. From then on, anything extra, you only pay 2% additional, which really means that as you get to the top of the pay scale, your marginal rate is less than would be the case when you're further down. So it is quite progressive in the middle. But what it doesn't do unlike a normal income tax, is that also it doesn't tax your savings, incomes from property that may come through rentals, for example. So it doesn't hit the people who perhaps are at the upper end of the wealth bracket. So it falls on workers. And I think that's what's being a concern, really, for the opposition. And it isn't very progressive when you go up to the higher end of the pay scale.
Also, Conservative MPs who oppose this tax say, well, actually, do we really need this now? As in, tax receipts were up towards the end of last year, putting extra billions into the economy. The economy is growing faster than had been predicted. And additionally, of course, with inflation helps to eat down government debt, which is kind of part of the reason for increasing taxes in the first place. So, fiscally, could the government, has it got the headwind, as we like to say, or the headroom, sorry, to not necessarily go ahead with this as we speak?
It does have the headroom, and it's been calculated that the headroom is quite substantial now because, indeed, they're collecting more taxes right now than they had expected. We have an unemployment rate which is considerably lower than had been anticipated, which means that many more people at work paying that tax. And also corporations have been paying more. So overall, yes, indeed, they are doing better than had been expected. And it is completely conceivable from a fiscal viewpoint to delay that by a year. But I think what they have judged is politically it doesn't make a huge amount of sense because that would suggest huge weakness. But we are seeing, as a result, loads and loads of other sort of carrots being given to backbench and, parts of the right wing, if you like, of the Conservative Party to make them happier, like the COVID, the removal of the requirement for, possibly, we still have to wait and see whether that's true, for vaccines, for compulsory vaccinations for health workers. And there could be other sweeteners that come, particularly in regard with electricity prices and other gas prices for households that will be going up. So I think we're at the point right now where, there will be loads and loads of announcements to sweeten or also the voters and households who, of course, are going to be hit hugely.
Well, those announcements are keeping us busy as well. Vicky, as always, thank you, Vicky Price there, joining us with her analysis this afternoon. OK, we're going to pause there on the briefing. Coming up, we've got a powerful interview with the Labour MP, Pauline Latham, where she talks about the sudden death, tragically, of her son. We'll also have an update from Tom Down at Downing Street with the latest on the Sue Gray report. All that and much more in the next 30 minutes. But first, just before 12:30, is the news. Rosie.
Good afternoon, it's 12:30. I'm Rosie Wright to keep you up to date here on GB News. Downing Street says it will publish the Sue Gray report into alleged lockdown rule-breaking in the form it's received today. It's understood the senior civil servant hasn't submitted her full report to Number 10 after the Met Police asked her to pare it back. Boris Johnson will make a statement on the findings in the House of Commons at 3:30 this afternoon. We'll bring that to you here on GB News. The government's expected to announce a U-turn over compulsory COVID vaccines for NHS workers. The Health Secretary Sajid Javid is reportedly going to scrap the policy over fears it could lead to a major staffing crisis. He's due to make a statement in the Commons later. Electricity companies are warning back-to-back storms could leave some people in Scotland without power for days. 40,000 homes are currently affected. 2 people were killed by falling trees in 90-mile-an-hour winds at the weekend. One of those was a 9-year-old boy. A British woman who was found guilty of lying about being gang-raped in Cyprus has had her conviction overturned. The woman, who's now 21, was given a 4-month suspended sentence in 2020 for public mischief after withdrawing her allegation. The Supreme Court of Cyprus found she'd not been given a fair trial. Formula One has announced that COVID-19 vaccinations will be mandatory for all staff with no exceptions. The new season is due to kick off in March with a record 23 races this year. It's understood all current drivers are fully vaccinated, but the rules will apply to teams, media, hospitality and guests as well. You are now up to date here on GB News. Don't forget we're on your TV, online and DAB+ radio. Now we'll have a short break and then we'll be back to the briefing with Darren.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Very welcome back to the briefing here on GB News. It is coming up to 26 minutes to 1 o'clock. Now, it's time for the latest of Gloria De Piero's interviews with MPs, where she goes beyond the politics and gets to know the real person. Conservative MP from Mid Derbyshire, Pauline Latham, speaks to Gloria about the very tragic sudden death of her son and about raising awareness for the rare condition that killed him.
Pauline Latham, tell me about your upbringing, your childhood.
Well, I was born in Lincolnshire, so I'm a Lincolnshire yellow belly, which not many people know what that means. And I was born to parents, but my parents split up when I was born. My mother left the hospital and went home to her parents because she couldn't cope with being married any longer and had to leave her eldest son because I was being brought up in a pub. And in those days, it was thought that a pub was a totally unsuitable place for a child to be brought up. So I was brought up basically by my grandparents for the first few years because my mother had to go out and work because she didn't have a job and she had to go and get a job so that she could pay for me and look after me and also pay her parents who didn't have an awful lot of money to be able to live there. So it was a bit tough, and my grandfather actually spent most of his time with me because my grandmother ran the pub. But then, unfortunately, my grandfather was ill and he thought he had cancer. So at the age of 46, he decided to die by suicide. He actually hung himself in the barn, which was a very, very difficult thing. And even though I was only 2 at the time, I do remember him before that time because I spent all my time with him. So that was a pretty difficult thing. And then my mother went on to marry and have 3 more brothers for me. And so I was one of 5, and 4 of them were boys, and I was the only girl. So interesting to be brought up with all men in the family.
And so your mum was a single parent, a lone parent?
Yes, which was unusual in those days. No benefits. She had to work to be able to keep me and to be able to pay for everything that she had. So that was tough. And she did that for 3.5 years until she married again.
What did she do, your mum?
She was, well, at that time, she was sort of a secretary, I think in a typing pool, and she married her boss in the end, which is an interesting situation. But, you know, opportunities for women were not there. As secretaries, you had to be. And in Lincolnshire, there were not many jobs for women.
Did you go to university, Pauline?
No, I didn't go to university, which I in a way now I regret, but at the time I didn't. I found it really hard to cope with exams. I'm not an exam person. I'm not somebody who can cram and spout it out. It took me a lot. I'm much better on continual assessment than I am on sudden stuff. So I didn't really want to go to university. And in fact, the opportunities for girls when I left school was you were a secretary, a nurse, a teacher, or a hairdresser.
Yeah.
And those were my career options.
Which one did you choose?
I didn't choose any of them. I actually went to work, and you won't remember this. There's a shop called Griffin and Spalding's in Nottingham on Slab Square, because by that time I'd moved to Nottingham, and that was the Debenhams,
Yes.
which it became the Debenhams, but it was a very, very high-class store, and I worked in, would always term, the middle model dress department, because it wasn't the top model, and it wasn't the everyday, it was in between. So it was a really interesting place to start, because I did learn about customer service, which is very useful as an MP, because you do need to do customer service as an MP.
You had a real job.
I had a real job.
Good for you.
Actually, what was amazing in those days, you could walk out of school into a real job. You could work. And then I went to work in a bank later on. So I've had several real jobs. And then I had a family, and again, there were no opportunities or few opportunities to go back to work as a mum. So I didn't work for a number of years, but did a lot of voluntary and charity stuff. So I've had a very varied life, and you could say, well, what prepares you to be an MP? Well, everything and nothing. There is no job description as to what you need to do. And many MPs now, they're nearly all graduates, they've nearly all worked in sort of quite high-powered jobs. Many of them worked in London, and London isn't what the country's all about, in my view. I think you need to get a job and live in what I would term the real world outside.
I agree with you. I think we need more MPs from
normal backgrounds. Yeah.
And when people say what's normal people know what normal is.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, indeed. Was it a political family?
It wasn't. My stepfather, who brought me up, who was my mum's boss, he actually went to nursery school with Margaret Thatcher. It was called kindergarten in those days. And also his father was Alderman Lee with Alderman Roberts in Grantham. So they were very close with the Roberts family.
Wow.
Obviously, once she went on to a girls' school and he went away to public school, they didn't see each other then, but the families remained very close. And actually, the older generation built Grantham Hospital. My grandfather, step-grandfather, was actually one of the founders of Grantham Hospital. So quite an interesting going from being with a single mother to that sort of background. And we weren't part of that part of the family. We were, if you like, the sort of distant part of the family, because my stepfather had married a divorcee, and that wasn't seen as a very good thing to do. So life's been checkered over the years.
How old were you when you joined the Conservative Party?
Well, I joined it when I was 18, but then I lapsed when I came to work in London for a couple of years and then go back to Derby. So I joined it properly when I was 39. Oh. So a long time ago now. But that's when late. I started to... Yes, it was quite late. But I've been busy having babies and doing all sorts of different things. So I wasn't a committed politician by any stretch of the imagination. It was only because of this thing that threatened my children's future that I decided I'd better get involved. Because if you don't get involved, you can't really criticise if somebody does something you really, really don't agree with. You need to get up and stand up and fight for it. So I joined the first committee of my life, and it was a school PTA, and the school PTA had to fight it because the governors in those days were all political appointments, bar two, and so they all voted with the politics of the day to get rid of the sixth form. Even though most of their kids went to it, they didn't want it because they were told not to want it. And so those of us who did believe in fighting it did, and it took a lot of fighting. We had an adjournment debate, funnily enough, in Parliament. We did petitions, we had articles in the paper every week, we had debates on the radio, local radio, all sorts of things, and we won. We beat the leader of the council, And he was furious. And then I decided, if politics is going to affect my kid's life in that way, then I better get involved. So I went on the county council in a by-election. And then I went on the city council, and I did both for a year. And then I think I always realised that actually I needed to be in Parliament to really have an impact. So that's why I decided. I campaigned 23 years to get to Parliament. It's not like it is now. They didn't want women in Parliament in safe seats, the Conservative Party, that is. And actually, although I don't agree with all women shortlists, I think it has transformed what's happened in Parliament. That's why there are so many women. So although I don't agree with it, and I still don't agree with it, it did move things on. And it did mean that women now don't have to wait 23 years. It's a long time.
You were going for selections?
Yes.
Parliamentary selections
Yes.
for 23 years.
I was.
And you don't... Pauline, what I'm thinking now is like, I don't understand, because you joined the party at 39. I can't even do the maths. Well, you're aging well, is what I was saying.
Well, I was 62 when I got to Parliament. It took me a long time.
Really?
Yes.
God, I had
Yes.
no idea.
Yes. Oh, yes. Well, I won't
You're
tell you
looking
now
good,
on national television how old I am, although you can do the maths.
Wow, so, gosh, 23 years going for selection.
And all over the country. I went to Mid Dorset, I went to Tatton, I went all over.
What is the worst question as a woman you were asked in those selections?
Oh, there were some pretty awful ones. I wasn't actually asked it, but somebody was asked, you've had one child, how many more do you intend to have? And I do know that women were asked at that time, well, how's your husband going to cope when you're in London all week? Well, husbands have to cope. Women have to cope if the men go away. You'd never ask that question as a man. So there were many sexist questions, which was because the Conservative Party in those days was made up of mainly old men, not many women, and the women wouldn't have dared to ask anything else. They wouldn't have dared to say to the chairman or whoever, you can't ask that. It was not done. So all sorts of inappropriate questions were asked, and you had to answer them. And I mean, there's questions about will you move to the constituency, all those sorts of things, which I understand, but the sexist ones were appalling. And I have to say I didn't get that bad a one, but lots of women I know did.
You talked about your children. In December 2018, you lose your son, Ben. Tell me what happened.
Well, he'd been in hospital in the afternoon. He'd been discharged, being told you've got transient amnesia, because he couldn't remember why he'd gone into hospital. And then he was sent home saying, well, we can't find what's wrong with you, and this is what's wrong with targets. I'm absolutely convinced it was the 4-hour target that they said, oh, God, we're getting close to that, get him out. And sent him home saying, come back if you're not better in the morning or if you feel worse. And that night he died. And he died from something called an aortic dissection. And most of your viewers will never have heard of that because you don't hear about it till it affects your family. So since then, I, with 2 others, have set up a charity, and it's the only charity in this country that deals specifically with this very niche aortic dissection. And it's about education for professionals to recognise it, because sometimes it's when the paramedics bring the patient into hospital and they have handover notes, but the doctors are too busy to bother to read them, and they think, well, we'll assess this, by which time the immediate problem has gone. You can't tell that somebody's having an aortic dissection because it's excruciatingly painful to start with, and then it goes off or can go off. So I think this is what happened in Ben's case. He didn't get diagnosed because they didn't actually do the right tests. And had they done a CT scan, he might still be here. So we've set this charity up, and we have got so many people doing things for us, but actually it's more about education. And now we've commissioned some research, or in the process of commissioning research, to try to find out why it happens. There are underlying health issues that some people have, but the majority don't. 2,000 people a year die that do not need to die. A lot are saved, and I'm not saying the whole of those 2,000 would live, but a good proportion of them would if they had the surgery, and you can be saved. It's not that rare, which is what some doctors say, well, it's a rare condition, you'll never see one in your professional career. they should be doing. They should be identifying it. So we're doing that. And we have somebody called Whispering Bob Harris, who is our ambassador, who's doing some amazing work for us, including filmed interviews with patients so that we can put them on the website to just try and help people come through this terrible, terrible situation. Some people who survive are traumatised because it is massive surgery. It's 12 hours long. It's big, big stuff. And you can have your whole aorta replaced. People make replica aortas to be put into people's chests, and people survive with that. So it's an incredibly rare, to the normal person, disease. It's not that rare. And we want to make sure that those people who go into hospital, like Ben, come out alive instead of coming out and then dying in the night. And it should never have happened. It just shouldn't have done.
Where are you on this stage of the grieving process?
It's still difficult. Okay. Very difficult.
Okay. We're elected at the same time.
Yes.
I spent all my time on the opposition benches, so I'm not really sure what I achieved in Parliament. What's your biggest achievement in Parliament?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because when I was on the council, I was always on the opposition benches, so I know exactly what it's like. You do nothing, you can't achieve a thing. But now I'm in Parliament, I can, and I am doing. I'm partway through getting a new bill to stop children being married under the age of 18. And that's all children, boys and girls. It predominantly affects girls, but it does affect some boys. And it's too young. I mean, they're children. If they can't sign for themselves and make a decision that is a crucial decision and a life-changing decision to get married, they shouldn't be doing it. They should not be being allowed to get married. So we are stopping that, and I hope it will be law by Easter, which is amazing. So when I leave Parliament, there will be one legacy. I hope there might be one or two more before I finish, but that's one legacy that I will have. And I'll be able to point to my grandchildren and great-grandchildren and said, I did that. And that's really important, because as a backbencher, I've never wanted to be a minister. I'm not bothered about that at all. I want to be a good backbencher. And by doing that, I will have done something significant.
What do you think people most get wrong about you?
I think they get wrong. They think I've been born with a silver spoon in my mouth. And I'm not saying I didn't have quite a privileged background once my mother remarried. So privileged to the point that we started off with 3 cars when most people didn't have a car. But my stepfather was not a good businessman. So although he'd got a business, he'd lost the whole lot. And he ended up almost with no money at all. So instead of, like most people, go from rags to riches, I went from rags to riches to rags as a family. We didn't have any money at the end. And so people do believe that I've had a silver spoon in my mouth, and they just don't know the truth at all. There's much more I could tell you. And in fact, people tell me I should write a book, but I don't think I've got the energy. But life is different. And as you say, you don't hear in Parliament these backstories at all. Nobody knows about it. And so they continue to think that I've got a silver spoon in my mouth, and that's not true at all. I think I'm quite grounded because of the experiences I've had and the empathy I can have with people who have had difficult times, because I've had difficult times.
And that is exactly why we do these interviews. Pauline Latham, thank you. Fascinating experiences, life experience and tragedy too. Thank you.
There you go. That was Gloria De Piero speaking to Pauline Latham a little bit earlier. Certainly a very tragic tale, but a very impressive career there from Pauline. OK, well, let's go back now to our top story, because Sue Gray has presented her update to the Prime Minister. We're expecting to get access to it ourselves. Indeed, the public, MPs, the media in the next couple of hours. And then Boris Johnson is due to go to Parliament to make a statement around 3:30 this afternoon. For all the latest, let's cross over to Tom Harwood, who is in Downing Street. Good afternoon to you, Tom. Just bring us up to date with what you're hearing, what the plan is for this afternoon.
Well, the Downing Street received the update, the report, of course, not the original report, but the version of the report that has these 8 instances that the Metropolitan Police is investigating stripped out and whittled down. That arrived by email at 11:20 this morning, and the plan is that Downing Street will publish that, they say, as soon as possible. That will be published on the government website and in the House of Commons library, and then after that, at 3:30 p.m, the Prime Minister will make a statement to the House on the report, on all of the allegations, and setting out his position, and probably hearing yet more apology from the Prime Minister, of course, of having apologised for the first time 2 weeks ago. He'll then take questions from the House, and we're expecting it to be a lengthy statement. We're expecting him to stick around in the House of Commons for quite some time, answering fulsomely questions from all sides of the House.
Yeah, fascinating, that, isn't it? Because there's reports, and I've seen you tweeting about it, that he is due to speak to Vladimir Putin at some point. Suggestions that was going to be at 4 p.m, which would make that statement very short, but the timing seemed slightly up in the air. But interestingly, he is going to speak to the Russian president a little later as well.
That's right. Now, Number 10 is currently in negotiations with the Kremlin as to when that call will take place. We're expecting late this afternoon or early this evening. But of course, there's other business in the House today as well. After the Prime Minister's statement, there's a statement from the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss with regard to an update to our sanctions regime, obviously in the context of Russia. And also after that, then the Health Secretary Sajid Javid making a statement on compulsory jabs, we expect, in the NHS. Of course, we're expecting that that mandate, that compulsion, will be dropped. So it's a very busy day in the Commons today, but of course 3:30, that key moment for the Prime Minister's statement, it will not be one to miss.
Indeed, Tom, let's drag you back, if we can, to the Sue Gray report. Interestingly, today, Downing Street not being able to confirm that when they do get the full report, after the Met have carried out their investigation, that they will publish it in full. That doesn't seem a sustainable position, does it?
No, it was very interesting. The Prime Minister's spokesman at our lobby briefing earlier today was saying not that they wouldn't publish it, but that they'd need to consult with the Metropolitan Police and with the Cabinet Office as to whether they're able to publish it. Now, a number of legislative people have noted that actually, if we get to that stage, that the Metropolitan Police has concluded its investigation and there seem to be no further preclusions on that original full report coming out, and Number 10 are holding back publishing that original full report, there are various parliamentary mechanisms that the opposition could use to force the publication of that report. And it would be a very brave Prime Minister, it would be a very brave government that would decide to whip their MPs against the publication of that report that, of course, they promised to publish just a few weeks ago. So, yes, we're going to see that first iteration of the report, the scaled-back report, in maybe minutes, maybe hours, but certainly today, and certainly before the Prime Minister gets on his feet at 3:30. But then the Metropolitan Police investigation could take quite some time to conclude. It could take months, it could take up to a year. Then we're really talking about publishing the original report that was written over the last few weeks in months and months' time. It's going to be potentially a less salient political issue when that time comes around.
Tom, appreciate that. Tom Harwood there, our political reporter, joining us from outside Downing Street, a windy Downing Street, it must be said. OK, that is it from me for today. I'll be back at 3 o'clock this afternoon. We'll bring you, of course, that Commons statement live. You will not want to miss it. Gloria, you'll be relieved to know, is back here at noon. And also, don't forget, we've got a North West Week special coming up. I'll be telling you more about that at 3. Liam Halligan is up next, though, at 1. Here's the weather before all of that.
Hello again. Storm Corrie is clearing away, but it's still windy out there. Cold wind as well, slowly easing through the day. Sunny spells for many, certainly in the east. A few showers in the west. There is that storm system that brought the damage across Scotland overnight. The low pressure heading away, but bringing some very strong winds to Germany and Belgium today. Behind it, the isobars slowly opening up, but as I said, still quite a